And before I get started on this episode, I want to make an apology for the audio quality. I was not able to look at the screen showing the meters on my recording software while I was reading from the news articles and the book Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions. So it sometimes got a little noisy. I've done my best to try and fix that, but it's still pretty shitty, I'm afraid. So just bear with me. Hopefully the next episode I won't be such a fuck up about it. I know what you're thinking. Do we really need an atheism-related podcast hosted by some idiot and his cat? Well, look at it this way. If an idiot like me can figure out that God's a bunch of bullshit, so can everybody else.
Is here! The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker, and that purring sound you hear is my co-host, Professor Fuzznuts, who, being the titty baby, has insisted upon being held in my arms while I do this. That's why he gets billed as a co-host. So, you're no doubt wondering who I am, why I'm here, and what the fuck I'm planning on doing with this podcast. Well, my name is Tucker. I'm a guy who got stuck living in a trailer park thanks to the shitty economy in this part of Tennessee. And one of the things I hope to accomplish with this podcast is to show that not all atheists are middle-class folks. And the cat, of course, is here because, well, he won't leave me alone. You adorable little bastard. As for what I want to do, besides just giving, the perspective of somebody who is not middle-class but is an atheist and lives in an area where, frankly, it's not too terribly safe to be an atheist, I live in a part of Tennessee that doesn't have the best reputation for handling minorities. I'll admit that I'm still working out the kinks as to exactly what I want to do with each episode, but I have some idea. And since this is an introductory episode, and it's, well, as such, it's going to sound like shit, like every other introductory episode of every other podcast, I'll give you what I've got worked out so far. In addition to covering, atheism-related news and news in this area that deals with religious nuttery, two things I thought I would do that nobody else seems to be doing. The first is I'm periodically, if I'm lucky enough, I'll be able to make it a regular feature, but it's kind of hard to find stories on it. But stories about people in third world countries developing innovative things in one manner or another. We often hear about Christian missionaries traveling to some third world country to, bring the word of Jesus to the people there. And, so they can better the lives of those poor heathens living in sin and desperate conditions. Well, there's some really neat things that people in third world countries do. I'll give you an example. I'll talk about it later in greater detail, but they'll build washing machines that are bicycle powered, or they'll develop like in the Philippines they have lights that are just simply bottles filled with a little bit of water and a little bit of bleach that are placed in the ceilings of buildings, and they act like a skylight and allow daylight inside the building. Things like that, because let's face it, that really brings an improvement to people's lives in those countries. Not telling them about Jesus, and it would be really nice if there was more coverage of it. And heck, some of it's interesting and something that folks here might be interested in. The other thing is that while, a lot of podcasts are doing a great job going over the Bible and reading it, or reading the Book of Mormon or the Quran, one of the things that nearly everybody talks about is how stories in the Bible, at least some of them, are borrowed from other religions. But so far as I know, there's no podcast that's dedicated to covering all the various religious stories that have been copied by the authors of the Bible. And there's a book that was written in the late 1800s by a guy named T.W. Doane called Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions. And it's a rather comprehensive look at just what it says, Bible myths and their comparisons in other religions. It takes sections of the Bible and, just reads from them, and then it compares them to sections from other mythologies, whether it be Egyptian or Greek or Hindu, what have you. In some cases, it actually goes through and says this is most likely the path by which this story was brought into the Bible. In other cases, it just guesses about how it may have gotten in there. If you're familiar with the writings of Joseph Campbell, it's sort of similar, but it, of course, predates Joseph Campbell by a number of decades. And he covers things that, so far as I know, Campbell didn't. I haven't read everything that Campbell wrote, but I've read a lot of it, and much of what he talks about, Campbell didn't cover for whatever reason. In some cases, he probably didn't know about it. In other cases, it may have been that Campbell had a different focus. One really interesting aspect of the book is that he will quote the writings of religious leaders from that time or from the early days of the church, and he quotes them saying things which no doubt would give modern fundamentalist Christians fits, because it says, talking about this or that aspect of, say, the creation, they'll say, well, this is, obviously this couldn't have happened in this manner. Like one of the most commonly cited things is, there's days before God creates the sun and the moon. And this book quotes one of the church fathers, Origen, as saying that, well, this is pretty silly. So obviously it must be an allegorical story and not an actual description of what happened. And that doesn't seem to get talked about very much these days, at least not in the podcasts I've listened to. I may have missed it, but I don't think so. I'm also interested in hearing any suggestions you might have as to things you'd like to hear covered that aren't being covered in other areas. The email address for the podcast is trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. At some point, when my finances allow it, I'll get a website set up and be able to do postings there, etc., etc. I will have, by the time you hear this, a Facebook page and probably a Google Plus page. I don't know. Nobody seems to use that. Okay. I don't have bumpers for everything as of yet, so you'll forgive me if the transitions are a little awkward at this point. Hopefully, when I cut the next episode, I'll have them recorded, so it won't be an issue. But in the meantime, please forgive my awkward transitions.
I am endeavoring, ma'am, to construct a mnemonic memory circuit using stone knives and bearskins. In
the third world innovation news, as calling it. We have the story of Remya Jose. My apologies if I mispronounced her name. This story comes from the National Innovation Foundation of India website. She's a really remarkable kid. Okay, this kid wants to be a doctor, right? And she's, whatever skill she may have as a doctor, she's a natural engineer, it sounds like. I mean, this is what some of the things that she's done. She has represented her school at various science fairs and won prizes for making a still model of a transmission tower for mobile phones and for a working model of an ingenious casserole which conserves heat, thus also functioning as a thermal cooker. For her 12th standard practical examinations, she made a model of a refrigerator in which vegetables, fruits, etc. would remain fresh up to a week. How she came up with the pedal-powered washing machine, it all happened because Remya's mother fell ill during her 10th standard exams and her father was undergoing cancer treatment. She had to change 3 buses while going to and coming from school and spend about 2 hours each way. As there was no washing machine at home, the chore of doing the laundry fell to her and her twin sister. So instead of just wishing futilely for a washing machine, she decided to try her hand at making one during the vacations. She had watched the functioning of an electric washing machine and thought of substituting the electrical power with mechanical power. She drew the basic diagram and her father took it to a nearby automobile workshop. He requested the workers to make it when they had a free hour and agreed to pay. He then purchased the materials according to his daughter's instructions and supplied them to the shop. Once she had explained to the mechanic personally how she wanted it to be done. Now, they've got pictures of it on the site, and I'll have it linked to on Facebook. I mean, I'm a machinist for a living, and, I'm impressed because figuring out how to do something like this is not easy. And she's a 16-year-old, well, at the time she was 14-year-old kid, going to school, taking care of her family, and she managed to figure that out. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, if she's as good a doctor as she is an engineer now, she'll be great. Hopefully, she'll be somebody who develops, medical devices that are innovative. I read somewhere one time that, a significant portion of people's time in third world countries is spent doing basic chores like that, and here you go, you got a kid who figured out an easier way of doing it, and that's way more helpful than any Bible would be for her. Okay, this next story comes from globalpost.com, and it's not a third world innovation story, but it's an atheism related story. Dateline Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. In this country known as the cradle of Islam, where religion gives legitimacy to the government and state-appointed clerics set rules for social behavior, a growing number of Saudis are privately declaring themselves atheists. The evidence is anecdotal but persistent. I know at least 6 atheists who confirmed that to me, said Fahad Al-Fahad, 31, a marketing consultant and human rights activist. 6 or 7 years ago, I wouldn't even have heard one person say that. Not even a best friend would confess that to me. A Saudi journalist in Riyadh has observed the same trend. The idea of being irreligious and even atheist is spreading because of the contradiction between what Islamists say and what they do, he said. The perception that atheism is no longer a taboo subject, at least 2 Gulf-produced television shows recently discussed it, may explain why the government has made talk of atheism a terrorist offense. The March 7th decree from the Ministry of Interior prohibited, among other things, calling for atheist thought in any form or calling into question the fundamentals of the Islamic religion on which this country is based. Gee, that sounds an awful lot like what some of the things the religious fundamentalist fuck nuggets in this country would say. I know plenty of people think that the folks in Saudi Arabia should keep their mouths shut because, let's face it, calling yourself an atheist in Saudi Arabia is a good way to get yourself killed. But, if people who are atheists don't speak up in some manner, even if it's anonymously, in such societies, there's no hope of change, ever. silence, as they say, equals death, and keeping it quiet that you're an atheist isn't going to get things to change. So, speaking up in a manner that's risky is a good thing. It might end up being fatal. Hopefully it's not. But it's encouraging to see that, even at the heart of Islam, there are people who are breaking out of the oppression that religion puts upon them and starting to say that, you know what, I don't care if I get killed. I'd rather have people know that I don't believe this bullshit than live a lie. I'm sure there are going to be people executed because of it, but, it's those kinds of things, the execution of not gays, but atheists, that is going to force the change. Hopefully these people who are bold enough to even anonymously say that they're atheists will be remembered in the years to come when Islam eventually falls from power. Okay, the next story is science related, and it comes from Wired.com, and the story is Pluto, Doorway to the Stars. The article gives a brief history of how Pluto was discovered and points out that it was a mathematical error that actually led to people looking for Pluto to begin with. And then you dig down into the story about the history of Pluto, and you get to what I think is the more interesting part of the story. George Peterson Field was the pen name of Dr. Robert Ford. Safely hidden behind the protective cloak of his nom de plume, the newly minted PhD physicist speculated in a quote-unquote science fact article in the December 1962 issue of Galaxy Science Fiction magazine that Pluto was a gift from a quote galactic federation unquote. He began by calculating that a body about the size of Mercury but with 6 times the mass of the Earth, and I'm going to interject here that this was originally what they thought Pluto was until they figured out that somebody had forgot to carry the 1 or some other mathematical error in their studies of the orbit of Neptune, would be so dense that it would have to be made of the collapsed matter found only in certain dwarf stars. Such an object could not exist naturally. Unrestrained by the massive gravity of a dwarf star, it should have exploded long ago. Therefore, Forward asserted, Pluto must be artificial. He suggested that Pluto was in fact a, quote, gravity catapult, unquote. He wrote that it would, quote, have to be whirling in space like a gigantic fat smoke ring, constantly turning from inside out, unquote. A spacecraft that approached the ring's center, moving in the direction of its spin, would be dragged through under terrific acceleration and ejected from the other side. If the acceleration of the ultra-dense smoke ring gave the spacecraft were about 1,000 times the acceleration Earth's gravity imparts to falling objects, then the ring would boost the spacecraft to nearly the speed of light in about 1 minute. The passengers and crew would, however, feel nothing as their spacecraft accelerated, for the gravitational force from the roiling ring would act on every atom of it uniformly. The ring would slow by a small amount as it accelerated the spacecraft. Forward wrote that a network of these devices in orbit around interesting stars would provide an advanced race with an energetically economical means of star travel. The rings in the network would cartwheel slowly so that over time they would point at many possible destination stars. A spacecraft accelerated by a ring could, upon arriving at another star in the network, enter that star's ring moving against the ring's spin. This would decelerate the spacecraft very rapidly and increase the ring's spin by a tiny amount. In effect, the spacecraft would pay back the network for the acceleration it borrowed when it began its journey. Forward ended his article by noting such a device could be shot through space by a larger gravity catapult and braked by pushing against a massive planet, such as Neptune. This, he added, might account for Pluto's odd orbit with respect to the eighth planet. He speculated that as sometime in the past, the Galactic Federation had noted the rise of humans and had launched Pluto toward Sol to serve as a coming-out present. Now, as somebody who grew up on science fiction, that's a pretty cool idea that I've never even heard of before. Utterly impractical for us to develop at any time in the next 200 or more years, but I think it's pretty freaking cool.
On the single condition that you identify the body or the living person of the slave called Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
Okay, for my last bit, I'm going to read from the introduction to Bible Myths and Their Comparisons, I'm going to read from Bible Myths and Their Parallels. Fuzz stupid cat. Okay, take 3. For the last part, I'm going to read from Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions. This is just going to be the introduction, so that way anybody who's smart and decided to skip the introductory episode won't really miss much. The idea of publishing the work here presented did not suggest itself until a large portion of the material it contains had been accumulated for the private use and personal gratification of the author. In pursuing the study of the Bible myths, facts pertaining thereto in a condensed form seemed to be greatly needed and nowhere to be found. Widely scattered through hundreds of ancient and modern volumes, most of the contents of this book may indeed be found, but any previous attempt to trace exclusively the myths and legends of the Old and New Testament to their origin, published as a separate work, is not known to the writer of this. Many able writers have shown our so-called sacred scriptures to be unhistorical and have pronounced them largely legendary, but have there left the matter, evidently aware of the great extent of the subject lying beyond. As Thomas Scott remarks in his English Life of Jesus, how these narratives, i.e. the New Testament narratives, unhistorical as they have been shown to be, came into existence, it is not our business to explain. And once again, at the end of the task, as at the beginning and throughout, we must emphatically disclaim the obligation to pursue the subject from the point at which it is abandoned by this and many other distinguished writers has been the labor of the author of this volume for a number of years. The result of this labor is herewith submitted to the reader, but not without a painful consciousness of its many imperfections. The work naturally begins with the Eden myth and is followed by a consideration of the principal Old Testament legends showing their universality, origin, and meaning. Next will be found the account of the birth of Christ Jesus, with his history until the close of his life upon earth, showing, in connection therewith, the universality of the myth of the virgin-born, crucified, and resurrected Savior. Before showing the origin and meaning of the myth, which is done in chapter 39, we have considered the miracles of Christ Jesus, the Eucharist, baptism, the worship of the Virgin, Christian symbols, the birthday of Christ Jesus, the doctrine of the Trinity, why Christianity prospered, and the antiquity of pagan religions, besides making a comparison of the legendary histories of Krishna and Jesus and Buddha and Jesus. The concluding chapter relates to the question, what do we really know about Jesus? In the words of Professor Max Mueller, The Science of Religion, page 11, a comparison of all the religions of the world, in which none can claim a privileged position, will no doubt seem to many dangerous and reprehensible, because ignoring that peculiar reverence which everybody, down to the mere fetish worshipper, feels for his own religion and for his own God, let me say then, at once, that I myself have shared these misgivings, but that I have tried to overcome them, because I would not and could not allow myself to surrender either what I hold to be the truth, or what I hold still dearer than truth, the right of testing truth. Nor do I regret it. I do not say that the science of religion is all gain. No, it entails losses, and losses of many things which we hold dear. But this I will say, that, as far as my humble judgment goes, it does not entail the loss of anything that is essential to true religion, and that, if we strike the balance honestly, the gain is immeasurably greater than the loss. All truth is safe, and nothing else is safe. And he who keeps back the truth, or withholds it from men, from motives of expediency, is either a coward, or a criminal, or both. But little beyond the arrangement of this work is claimed as original. Ideas, phrases, and even whole paragraphs have been taken from the writings of others, and in most, if not all cases, acknowledged. But with the thought in mind of the many hours of research this book may save the student and this particular line of study, with the consciousness of having done for others that which I would have been thankful to have found done for myself, and more than all with the hope that it may in some way help to hasten the day when the mist of superstition shall be dispelled by the light of reason. With all its defects, it is most cheerfully committed to its fate by the author. Boston, Mass., November 1882. Okay, so that's it. You will find, when I get the Facebook page up, and I'll, whenever I have the money to do a actual website, it will be duplicated there, and I will also throw up a freebie blog site here in the next few days. You'll find links to the Google Books version of that, so you can follow along if you want, and you can also verify that I'm not making any of this stuff up. I will say it would be pretty handy for you to at least know where to find a copy of that online, even if you don't intend on following the book, simply because I've read it before, and it has a huge number of footnotes, and there's no way in hell I'm going to be able to recite all of them. I will read all the ones that are pertinent, but I'm going to skip a few of them, and you'll probably want to check a few things, I'm sure, if you're really curious about the subject, and why wouldn't you be? You're listening to some idiot ramble on about it. Now, this episode is going to clock in at around half an hour. I will try to have future episodes running about an hour in length. It all depends on news, etc., because some of the chapters in that book are longer than the others, so a few episodes may be nothing but me reading the chapters, and others of them may be me reading the news, ranting and screaming about other things. It all just depends. But your questions, comments, criticisms, etc. are welcome. The email address for the podcast is, again, trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Say goodnight, Fuzznuts. Damn cat.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.